The Arizona Territory, 1875, a place where dust never settled and law came only by way of a six-shooter or a prayer. Between the high red mesas and the twisting veins of the San Pedro River lay a small, stubborn town called Silver Creek. To the east, Apache land stretched wild and empty, breathing with ghosts and thunder. To the west, white settlers plowed the desert into submission. Between them lay a fragile peace, one that trembled with every rumor, every whisper of old blood. The people of Silver Creek lived with rifles by the door and mistrust in their hearts. They had seen raids, watched friends carried home on stretchers of cedar, and lost cattle and kin to warriors who moved like shadows. So when one of those warriors chose to stay, to live among them, it was a thing not easily forgiven. His name was Taza, son of a Chiricahua chief. He had once ridden with Geronimo himself, a ghost in the canyons, fierce and proud, but too many winters of war had carved his soul raw. He had buried brothers and burned villages until even victory tasted bitter. When the treaties were signed, Taza broke from his band, walking away from both the fight and the blood debt that came with it. He came alone to Silver Creek with nothing but a knife, a horse, and a silence deep as canyon stone. He built himself a small cabin near the river's bend, working leather and mending saddles for the men who both feared and needed him. He rarely spoke. Some said he was waiting for what none could say. Others said he was hiding from the vengeance of his own people. But those who looked into his eyes saw no fear, only exhaustion. He was a man who had seen too much and still hadn't found peace. One evening in late spring, as the desert sun bled gold over the town's single dusty street, a wagon rattled into Silver Creek carrying Reverend McGraw and his daughter Eleanor. She was 22, with storm-gray eyes and the kind of beauty that made men stand a little straighter when she passed. Her friends called her Ellie, though she had precious few in this new hard land. She'd grown up among rolling Kansas prairies where the grass whispered hymns and the worst danger came from a summer tornado. The wildness of Arizona both terrified and thrilled her. Her father had come to build a church, a fragile steeple of faith in a land that had little use for sermons. Ellie had come because she couldn't bear to let him go alone. The day they arrived, the wind carried the scent of mesquite smoke and dust. Men watched her from the saloon porch, their faces weathered and suspicious. She returned each gaze with quiet courage. Beneath her modest bonnet beat a heart full of curiosity, and when she first heard talk of the Apache who stayed, her eyes lit not with fear, but with wonder. It was a week later that she saw him for the first time. She had gone down to the river with a pail, the sun high and cruel above her. The water ran low that season, whispering over stones like secrets half told. And there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, his skin bronzed by sun and wind, his hair bound loosely behind him. He was kneeling by the riverbank, washing the dust from a strip of rawhide. The air around him seemed stiller somehow, as if even the breeze dared not disturb him. Ellie froze. He turned his head slightly and their eyes met, dark against light, two strangers divided by 1,000 miles of history. She expected him to speak or turn away, but he simply nodded once, respectfully, then went back to his work. She lingered a moment, caught between fear and fascination, before gathering her courage to say softly, "Good day." His voice came low and rough, shaped by another tongue. "Good day," he echoed without looking up. It was a simple thing, but it settled deep in her memory like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling long after she walked away. That night, as she helped her father unpack hymnals and hammerboards for the chapel, she found herself thinking of that man by the river. Something in his silence stayed with her. When she asked about him at supper, her father's face hardened. "Best not to speak of him, Ellie. He's an Apache, one who chose to live among us. The town tolerates him, but only barely. Stay clear of that man." "But why?" she asked. "Has he done anything wrong?" Her father sighed. "He's done the wrong thing by being who he is. Out here, that's enough." Ellie said no more, but inside her heart a quiet rebellion took root. A week later, trouble came. A group of ranch hands full of whiskey and bad intentions decided to remind the savage he wasn't welcome. Near sundown, they rode out to the river cabin, shouting slurs and hurling stones at his door. Ellie, walking home from the chapel, heard the commotion and followed it. When she saw the men circling the cabin, torches flaring in the dusk, something in her snapped. Without thinking, she ran forward. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice clear as a bell. The men turned, startled to see the preacher's daughter standing before them, cheeks flushed with fury. "He's done no harm to any of you." "Stay out of it, miss," one man growled. "This ain't your concern." "It is when you attack an innocent man," she said. "Put those torches out now." Her courage shamed them more than any sheriff could have. They muttered, spat, and rode off into the dark, leaving silence behind. Taza had stepped outside during the commotion, one hand near the knife at his belt, but he hadn't moved to fight. Now he looked at her, not with gratitude, not with confusion, but with something older, deeper respect. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "I couldn't stand by and watch," she replied. "They will talk." "Let them." A faint smile ghosted across his lips, the first she'd ever seen from him. "You are brave," he said simply. "Or foolish." "Maybe both," she admitted. As the last of the sun dipped below the ridges, a strange calm settled between them. Ellie, her skirts dust-stained and her heart hammering, felt the world tilt, as if some invisible line had been crossed. She turned to leave, but before she did, she looked back once more. The man stood in the doorway of his cabin, the firelight behind him painting his silhouette in gold and shadow. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. For all his silence, there was something in Taza's eyes that spoke louder than words, something that called to the part of her that had always yearned for meaning beyond sermons and small-town gossip. That night, the desert wind howled low and mournful through the canyons, carrying with it a whisper, the beginning of a story neither of them yet understood. A story of defiance, redemption, and love that would challenge everything Silver Creek believed. And far out where the stars burned over the mesas, the spirits of Taza's ancestors stirred, sensing that their wandering son had finally found the place he would stay. The days that followed the attack on Taza's cabin changed something in Silver Creek, though not for the better. Whispers slithered through the saloon and general store like rattlesnakes in the brush. The preacher's daughter defended the Apache. "She's lost her mind." Some said she was bewitched. Others claimed she was simply too soft-hearted for her own good. Ellie heard every word, though no one dared say it to her face. She carried herself as if untouched by gossip, chin high, bonnet tied neat beneath her throat. But when she walked through town, she felt the stares prickling like needles on her back. Only her father's eyes softened with worry. "Eleanor," Reverend McGraw said one evening as they sat beside the small fire in their unfinished parsonage, "this isn't Kansas anymore. People here live by fear, and fear is a cruel master. I beg you, child, leave that man to his solitude." She folded her hands around a cup of coffee, staring into the flames. "He's done nothing wrong, Father. They treat him as if he were less than human." "Because to them he is," he said bitterly. "The war took sons from this town. They don't forgive easily." "Then maybe someone should remind them how to." Her father sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You have your mother's stubbornness, just be careful, Ellie. Hearts break easier than bones in this place." She promised she would, though even then, she knew she wouldn't keep that promise. The next morning, Ellie baked bread in the mission kitchen. The smell filled the small wooden room, warm, yeasty comfort against the desert wind. She wrapped a loaf in linen and walked toward the river, her boots crunching over sand and stone. Taza was outside, repairing a saddle beneath the cottonwoods. He didn't look up as she approached, though his hands stilled for a moment, listening, sensing. "I brought you something," she said softly. He glanced up then, eyes narrowing against the sun. "You shouldn't come here," he said. His voice was even but not unkind. "Why not?" "Because they will talk," he replied simply. Ellie smiled faintly. "They already do." She set the bread on the porch rail. "And besides, I don't care much for what fearful men say." For a long moment, Taza said nothing. Then, without meeting her eyes, he tore off a small piece of the bread, tasted it, and nodded. "Good," he murmured. "Like the kind my mother made long ago. Before the soldiers came," her breath caught. "You had a family?" His gaze drifted toward the horizon, a thin line of purple hills fading into the heat. "Everyone had a family once," he said. "Mine live in the wind now," she didn't press him. Something about his stillness warned her that every word he offered was precious and hard-won. Instead, she sat on the steps, listening to the river whisper through the reeds. After a while, she said, "My mother used to sing when she baked. Old hymns, mostly. My favorite was Come Thou Fount. Taza tilted his head. Sing it. She hesitated, then began softly, her voice trembling like the wings of a bird. The tune rose and fell with the wind, carrying across the water. When she finished, Taza's eyes were distant, not empty but full of something unspeakable. She had a beautiful voice, he said quietly. Like yours, Ellie smiled sadly. She's gone too, typhoid. They sat in silence after that. Two souls from worlds apart, bound by loss and a strange, fragile understanding. When Ellie left that afternoon, Taza watched her go until she was no more than a speck among the mesquite trees. He told himself he should stop her from coming, that her kindness would only bring her harm. Yet deep down he found himself waiting for her return, and she did return on every day. Sometimes with bread, sometimes with apples from the preacher's small orchard, sometimes with nothing but conversation. She asked about his people, and he told her in careful fragments the stories of the white-painted woman who gave birth to the Apache people, the songs sung at sunrise to greet the four winds. He told her how his name, Taza, meant child of the dawn. She told him about Kansas winters, about books and music, and about how she used to climb trees barefoot when her father wasn't looking. You were not afraid? He asked once, amused. Of falling, always. But I climbed anyway. He smiled, a small, quiet thing that warmed his face like sunlight through clouds. You are not like the others. No, she said softly, and neither are you. As weeks passed, the tension between them deepened into something that frightened them both, not with danger, but with its purity. The air between them grew thick with unsaid words. One evening, as thunderheads gathered over the horizon, Ellie walked to his cabin just as the first drops of rain fell. By the time she reached his porch, she was drenched, her dress clinging to her skin. You shouldn't be here, he said again. But his voice lacked conviction. I had to see you, she breathed. Lightning split the sky. Taza lit a small fire and handed her a blanket. Their hands brushed, a spark more powerful than the storm itself. For a moment, neither moved. Outside, rain drummed against the roof, steady and wild. Inside, time seemed to slow. Ellie looked up at him, her heart pounding. His face was calm, but his eyes burned, dark, unreadable, yet filled with yearning. Taza, she whispered. He turned away, his jaw tight. You don't understand. If they see you here, they will hurt you. I'm not afraid. You should be. She stepped closer. All my life I've done what I was told and what was safe. But when I look at you, I feel alive. Isn't that worth something? His breath came rough, heavy. You are brave, woman. But I am not the man you think I am. I see who you are, she said, voice trembling. You left behind blood and war to find peace. You work, you live quietly, you harm no one. That's more than most men can say. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling. Then as thunder rolled low and slow across the sky, Taza lifted a hand and brushed a raindrop from her cheek. Your people would never forgive you, he said softly. Then I'll forgive myself, she replied. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin there was a calm as deep as prayer. Neither spoke again, yet everything between them was said. In the silence, in the closeness, in the wild rhythm of rain on the roof. When the storm finally broke near dawn, Ellie rose to leave. Taza walked her to the edge of the clearing. You'll catch cold, he murmured. I've weathered worse, she smiled. And as she walked back toward town, shoes heavy with mud and heart light with something new, she didn't notice the man watching from the ridge, one of the ranch hands from the saloon. His eyes were narrow, his mouth twisted in anger. By the time Ellie reached home, the first whispers had already begun anew. That day, Reverend McGraw saw the look in his daughter's eyes and knew what he feared most had come to pass. Love, wild, impossible love, had taken root between the Apache who stayed and the woman who dared. Summer came early to Silver Creek, dry and cruel. The desert wind carried heat like a brand, and tempers burned with it. The people of the town had long memories, and Ellie McGraw's defiance had become their favorite subject of poison. Men muttered in the saloon, their words thick with whiskey and resentment. That preacher's girl's been visiting the Apache again. Ain't right, another spat. A woman's got no business keeping company with a redskin. Preacher ought to rein her in, a third added, slamming his glass down. The sheriff, a weary man named Tom Barlow, who'd seen enough hate for 2 lifetimes, only shook his head. Let the girl be, he said. She ain't hurtin' no one. But his voice carried little authority. The town was a tinderbox waiting for a match. Meanwhile, Ellie's visits to Taza had grown quieter, more intimate. She brought him seeds for a small garden by the river, and he built her a chair from pine and rawhide, smoothing every edge with care. She taught him to read simple words from a worn Bible, not for religion, but for the joy of language itself. In turn, he taught her words in Apache, Shiye, my heart, Gozu, beautiful. She repeated them shyly, her tongue unfamiliar with their rhythm, and he would smile. Not the cautious smile of before, but something deeper, warmer. They spoke little of love, but it hung between them, unspoken and undeniable. One evening, under a sky streaked with red and gold, Ellie asked him, Do you ever miss them? Your people? Taza was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said at last, but I cannot go back. To them I am already dead, she frowned. Why? When a warrior lays down his rifle and refuses the call to war, he is no longer one of them. They call him Disani, a ghost. Her heart ached at the word. Then you belong nowhere? He looked at her, the fading light turning his eyes to amber. Maybe here, he said softly. Maybe with you. Ellie felt her breath catch. She wanted to reach for him, but fear, not of him but of the world, held her still. They'd never understand, she whispered. Then let them hate, Taza replied. The desert does not care for the noise of men. They stood side by side as twilight deepened, their hands brushing once in a fleeting touch, but enough to seal something sacred between them. But peace in the West was a fragile thing. It began with a single jealous heart. Luke Tanner, the rancher's son, had fancied Ellie since the day she'd arrived. Her polite refusals had stung his pride. Her loyalty to the Apache cut him to the bone. You'd choose him over me? He had sneered one afternoon outside the general store. Ellie hadn't answered. Her silence was answer enough. That night, Luke and 2 others rode out toward the river. They found Taza near the corral tending his horse under the moonlight. Well, if it ain't the preacher's pet savage, Luke called out, his grin sharp as a knife. Heard you've been spending a lot of time with Miss McGraw. Thinking of making her your squaw? Taza didn't rise to it. He stood tall, calm. You should leave. But Luke was drunk on hate and humiliation. He swung down from his horse. You think you're one of us living here playing at being civilized? He shoved Taza hard. You don't belong. Taza's patience snapped like a dry branch. The fight was fast and brutal. Dust rising, fists cracking, the sound of flesh meeting fury. Luke went down hard, his nose broken, his pride shattered. His friends pulled him back, shouting, Enough! But Luke's hatred only grew. You'll pay for this, he spat, blood on his lips. You and that preacher's whore. Taza froze. For the first time, rage flickered behind his calm. He stepped forward, eyes blazing. Do not speak her name. But before it could go further, Sheriff Barlow and 2 deputies arrived, drawn by the commotion. They saw only one truth, a bloodied white man and an Apache with his fists clenched. Put him in the cell, the sheriff ordered, though his voice was heavy with regret, before this town tears itself apart. The jail was little more than a single room beside the saloon, hot as an oven by day and cold as a grave by night. Taza sat on the cot, silent, bruised but unbroken. The sheriff tried to talk to him, but he spoke little. You shouldn't have hit him, Barlow said. He brought war to my door, Taza replied simply. I only answered. Word spread fast, as bad news always does. By morning, half the town was gathered outside the jail, some calling for the Apache to be driven out, others simply watching, waiting for blood. Ellie came through the crowd like a storm, her bonnet gone, her hair loose, eyes fierce. Let me through, she demanded. The sheriff hesitated but opened the door. Inside, she found Taza sitting in the dim light, hands bound, a bruise on his jaw. Her throat tightened at the sight. They had no right, she said. You did nothing wrong, Taza shook his head. I brought this. I should have gone when you asked me to. I never asked you to leave, she whispered. His gaze lifted to hers, dark, steady. Then I am the reason they hurt you now. I see the stone that hit your cheek. She touched the small cut there and smiled sadly. They can throw their stones, Taza. They cannot break me. He looked away, muscles tight. You should go, before they turn on you. Ellie stepped closer, kneeling before him. No, if you leave, they win. They'll say love between us was shame, when it's the only thing in this cursed town that's true. His eyes softened. Love. he murmured, tasting the word as if it were strange to him. In my tongue we say Shie Nijoni go ayo aninishni. I love you beautifully. Tears filled her eyes. Then say it again, she whispered. He did, softly, reverently. And in that dark, airless cell, the world outside ceased to exist. The next morning, Sheriff Barlow came to unlock the door. You're free, he said gruffly. Tanner's father wants no more trouble. Taza nodded once. I thank you. But when he stepped outside, the townsfolk's eyes burned holes in him. Children stared. Women turned away. He ignored them all and walked toward the edge of town, where Ellie waited beneath a cottonwood tree. You're leaving, she said, her heart breaking even as she spoke. I must, he answered. If I stay, they will never rest. She reached for his hand. Then take me with you. He looked at her in pain. You would not survive my world. It is hard and cruel and filled with ghosts. Then I'll learn, she said fiercely, because I can't live without you. He touched her cheek, a gesture both tender and final. If I go, he said softly, I go alone. But know this, Ellie McGraw, you are my home, even if I never see you again. He turned then, walking into the burning desert light, his figure shrinking until it was swallowed by the horizon. Ellie stood there long after he was gone, tears mixing with dust on her face. She thought of all the sermons her father had preached about faith and mercy, and wondered if love wasn't the truest faith of all. That night, she lit a candle in her window, a small flame trembling against the dark, her silent message to the man who had no home except the one she carried in her heart, and out beyond the ridges, where the coyotes cried and the stars watched coldly, Taza saw that single light in the distance, and turned back toward it. The summer storms came late that year, angry, swollen clouds that rolled across the Arizona sky like dark cattle. When they broke, they brought not relief but fire. Lightning struck the hills north of Silver Creek, setting the dry brush ablaze. Men rode out to fight it, their faces blackened with soot while the women prayed from their porches. The land itself seemed to burn with all the hate the town had been hiding. And in the middle of it all, Ellie McGraw refused to let her candle go out. Taza had disappeared into the desert 2 days earlier, leaving behind nothing but a trail of hoofprints and an ache she couldn't name. She went about her chores in silence, ignoring the whispers, clinging to the hope that he would come back. Because men like him did not run from storms. They met them head-on. Her father tried to comfort her, but the worry in his eyes betrayed him. He's gone, child, Reverend McGraw said quietly. It's for the best. The desert takes what it must. Ellie shook her head. No, father. The desert tests the soul. It doesn't take what belongs to love. That night, while the wind howled and thunder rolled over the mesa, she dreamed of him, standing alone beneath the storm, arms outstretched, calling for something she could not hear. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a strange certainty in her heart. He would come back, and he did. At dawn, when the first light crept over the red ridges, Taza rode into town, his horse lathered, his face streaked with dust. He dismounted in front of the church where Ellie was sweeping the steps. She froze, broom in hand. You came back, she whispered. I had to, he said simply. The fire on the ridge, and I helped the men fight it. Some were hurt. Were you? He shook his head. No. But I heard them speak of what they will do when the flames die. Her stomach tightened. What do you mean? They plan to come for me tonight, he said, his voice low. Tanner and his men. They say Silver Creek will not be safe until I am gone, for good. Ellie's blood ran cold. Then we'll leave now before they come. Taza's eyes softened. If I run again, I will never stop running. I am done living like a hunted animal. Then I'll stand with you, she said fiercely. If they come for you, they'll find me beside you. He looked at her for a long time, at the stubborn tilt of her chin, the courage burning in her eyes. You would do that? I already have, he wanted to protest, to tell her she didn't understand what was coming. But he knew better than to argue with a woman who had already faced down a mob once. So they rode together back to his cabin by the river, the same place where their story had begun. The air was heavy, thick with smoke from the distant fires. The sun bled red behind the ridges, painting the world in a light that looked too much like prophecy. By nightfall they could hear the horses before they saw them, a low thunder rolling through the valley. Ellie stood on the porch, her hands trembling but her heart steady. Taza loaded his rifle, though his face was calm, solemn. "They'll come shouting," he said quietly. "Don't answer them." "I won't." When the riders finally emerged from the darkness, their torches burned like false stars. There were a dozen men, maybe more, Luke Tanner at their head, his face twisted with drink and hate. "Come out, Apache," he yelled. "Time to finish what you started." Taza stepped forward, unarmed now, his rifle left on the porch. He raised his hands. "I came here to live in peace," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "You have your land. I ask for nothing but to be left alone." "Left alone?" Luke spat. "You think you can bed one of ours and talk about peace?" Ellie stepped forward then, her dress white in the firelight, her voice ringing clear. "Enough!" she cried. "This man has done no harm. If you mean to hurt him, you'll have to go through me first." The men hesitated. Even the drunken ones felt the weight of her courage. The preacher's daughter, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man they'd been taught to hate. It was a sight none could make sense of. Taza turned slightly toward her. "Ellie," he murmured, "you should go inside." "No," she said, her chin lifting. "I stay," Luke Tanner sneered. "So be it." He lifted his rifle. The shot cracked the night open. Ellie gasped, stumbling. For a heart-stopping second, she thought she was dead, but the bullet had only grazed her shoulder. Still, the pain sent her to her knees. Taza was at her side in an instant, his arms catching her before she fell. Rage and fear surged through him like wildfire. He looked up at the mob, his voice ringing out like thunder. "You call yourselves men, and yet you shoot at a woman." The sheriff arrived just then, drawn by the noise. "Enough!" Barlow roared, firing his pistol into the air. "This ends now." The crowd wavered, their courage faltering under the sheriff's glare. "Go home, all of you," he barked. "Before I start hanging men for murder." One by one, the riders turned back, their torches fading into the darkness until only silence remained. Taza carried Ellie inside and laid her on the bed, his hands shaking as he cleaned and bound her wound. The blood wasn't deep, but it was enough to remind him how fragile this world was, how easily love could be taken by hate. She stirred, her face pale. "You stayed," she whispered. "I stay," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Because you called me home." Tears slipped down her temples. "If I die," he hushed her gently. "No, you will live. You are strong, Ashkia Yoga, my brave one." He sat by her side through the night, holding her hand as the storm outside finally broke, rain washing the smoke from the valley. When dawn came, the world smelled of wet earth and rebirth. By morning, word had spread. The town was quiet, ashamed. Reverend McGraw came to the cabin, his hat in his hands, his face drawn with grief and love. "I came to see my daughter," he said softly. Taza stepped aside. "She sleeps." "The wound is small," the old man nodded. "Thank God." He hesitated, looking around the small, simple cabin, the fire burning low, the walls lined with carved wood and handmade tools. "You've built yourself a good life here," he said finally. "Better than some who claim to be civilized." Taza said nothing. Reverend McGraw turned toward the door, then paused. "You love her?" "With all that I am." The preacher's voice was barely a whisper. "Then I cannot curse what God himself has blessed with courage." He left without another word. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, Ellie woke to find Taza dozing beside her. She reached for his hand, her voice faint but sure. "We made it through," he smiled, a rare, peaceful smile. "Yes, the fire is gone." Outside, the desert bloomed after the rain, wildflowers rising from scorched earth, a promise of new life. And for the first time since he had laid down his rifle, Taza felt what it meant to be home. Not a place, not a tribe, but a person. The smoke had long cleared from the valley, but the memory of that fire stayed in the hearts of those who had seen it. The men of Silver Creek stopped whispering when Ellie McGraw walked by, and the women who once turned their heads now greeted her with cautious smiles. Time, as always, smoothed the rough edges of hatred, especially when it was shown a better way to live. And the better way, it turned out, began at the small cabin by the river. The cabin had once been a lonely outpost on the edge of the world, where an Apache warrior tried to forget the blood of his past. Now it was a home, the kind built with laughter, prayer, and the sound of two hearts beating together through every trial that came. Ellie healed slowly, her shoulders stiff for months, but her spirit never faltered. Each morning, Taza would help her into the sunlight, where she'd sit on the porch and watch him split wood or tend the corral. The rhythm of his movements, strong, patient, steady, became her peace. Sometimes she'd hum one of the old church hymns while he worked, and he'd glance over his shoulder, smile faintly, and say, "That song, it speaks of rain, it speaks of grace," she'd reply. He'd nod. "They are the same." And she knew deep down he was right. That first winter tested them both. The snows came early, heavy and merciless. The creek froze solid, and the trails into town were swallowed by white silence. They had only each other, a few sacks of flour, and a stubborn will to live. But there, in the hush of winter, they learned the true shape of love, not the kind that burns fast and fierce, but the kind that endures. They spent the long nights by the fire, trading stories of their worlds. Taza spoke of his mother, who taught him the language of the wind and how to listen to the earth. Ellie told him of her childhood, how she'd grown up fearing the desert and the people who lived in it. They laughed, cried, and came to understand that they were both products of pain and promise. Two sides of the same coin, spun by the same creator. One night, as snow drifted against the window and the fire crackled low, Ellie reached for his hand. "Do you ever wish you'd gone back to your people?" she asked softly. Taza looked into the flames, thinking. "Sometimes," he said, "when I dream of my brother's face or hear the drums in the wind. But then I wake and you are beside me, and I remember why I stayed." She smiled through tears. "And why's that?" He touched her cheek gently. "Because you called me home." She leaned into him, her voice trembling with warmth. "Then don't ever go wandering too far, you hear?" He laughed softly, a sound rare and sacred. Never too far. When spring came, it came wild and full of color. The desert bloomed with flowers like spilled paint, and the hills above Silver Creek shimmered with new life. Taza built her a small garden, fenced and neat, with rows of corn and beans. Ellie planted flowers among them just for beauty's sake, and Taza watched her with a quiet kind of awe. "You plant like a woman of the river," he said once, admiring the way her fingers pressed life into the soil. "And you build like a man who's trying to make the world whole again," she answered, smiling. Soon, word spread through the valley of the strange pair who lived together, the Apache who stayed, and the preacher's daughter who refused to abandon him. What began as gossip slowly turned to respect. The sheriff stopped by often, bringing supplies. Even Reverend McGraw came, awkward at first, but warming each time he saw the light in his daughter's eyes. It was on one such visit that he found them sitting under the cottonwood tree, laughing as Taza carved a small wooden cradle. "A cradle?" the Reverend asked, blinking. Ellie's cheeks flushed. "Yes, Father." The old man smiled then, the kind of smile that carried more grace than words ever could. "Then I suppose it's time I start building a bigger pew." They all laughed, and that day the walls that had stood between blood and belief crumbled a little more. Months passed. The child came with the first thunder of summer, a strong boy with dark hair and eyes that mirrored the wide blue sky. Ellie held him close, her body trembling from both pain and wonder. Taza knelt beside her, tears cutting lines through the dust on his cheeks. "What shall we name him?" she whispered. Taza looked down at the tiny bundle. "In my tongue there is a word, to-e-nana. It means water bringer. He will bring life where others see only dust." Ellie smiled, exhausted but radiant. "Water bringer," she repeated softly. "Then Water bringer McGraw it is." Taza chuckled. "A good name, half yours, half mine." "That's how all good things should be," she said, her fingers curling around his. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft and steady, like a blessing. Years turned like the pages of a weathered Bible. Silver Creek grew, a little town that finally learned to live without fear. Children with fair hair and copper skin played together in the dusty streets, and no one thought twice about it. The cabin by the river became a place folks spoke of with quiet reverence, the home of the couple who proved that love could outlast war, prejudice, and the desert itself. Ellie and Taza grew older together, their hair silvering under the same sun that once saw them as enemies. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch with their son, now tall, strong, and full of both worlds, and listen to the coyotes sing. Sometimes Taza would tell stories of his youth, of battles fought and brothers lost, and Ellie would listen with tears shining in her eyes. One night, when the stars were bright and the wind was gentle, she leaned against his shoulder and said, "Do you ever think we were meant to find each other?" He smiled. "The river finds the sea even after 1,000 miles. That is how we found each other." She closed her eyes, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "Then promise me, Taza, when my river ends, you'll follow it home." He turned his face to the stars. "Always." When Ellie passed, years later, beneath that same cottonwood tree, the whole town came to mourn. The preacher's daughter, the woman who taught Silver Creek what forgiveness meant. Taza stood by her grave, their son beside him, the wind tugging at his braids. His heart ached, but it did not break, for he knew she was not gone, only waiting where the rivers met the sky. He stayed in that cabin till his last breath, carving her name into the doorway where he could see it each morning. And when he finally joined her, years later the townsfolk buried him beside her, beneath the same cottonwood tree that had once shaded their laughter. The wind through its branches sounded, almost like a hymn, and the people of Silver Creek said that if you stood there at sunset, you could still hear her laughter and his low voice answering, as if the desert itself whispered their story. He was the Apache who stayed, and she was the woman who called him home.